something you would expect. You would expect that the plot closest to you is going to be more similar to you than a plot that's 2 kilometers away. This is something that we expected. But what we wanted to ask was, why are we seeing these variations? You know, which direction is it correlated in, and what factors are really influencing these? So we narrowed down 3 environmental factors that we wanted to test against this first finding. First was flooding intensity, and a lot of literature has supported that you can quantify flooding intensity as distance from the dry season channel, because it logically makes sense that plots closer to the channel are going to be more frequently and more strongly inundated by a flooding event than a plot really far away from the dry season channel. We also looked at grazing impact, so we created an index based on the percentage of biomass grazed on a plot. And then the third thing that we looked at was north-south orientation, and I'll get a little bit more into the reason why we looked at that later on when I explain our findings. A couple things we didn't end up looking at was soil texture. There's absolutely no measurable difference between the soil samples that we took. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do things like moisture, things we just looked at texture. So it's possible that there could be a couple aspects of soil that require further investigation, but for our purposes, we didn't look at that. And we didn't find any variation in litter amounts across the system. So neither of these variables were very important to test. So based on how we tested this, basically we created a secondary matrix to test against our first matrix, and then we also compared each of these variables between the 2 groupings that I showed you previously. And what we found was, in terms of the spatial factors, so the flooding intensity and the north-south sort of orientation of the plots, we found very poor correlation of species association with distance from the river. And this was probably one of our most interesting findings, because, sorry, excuse me, I've got a cold. This was probably one of our more interesting findings, because a lot of literature on riverine floodplain systems have really concentrated on flooding as the major disturbance for determining where a species can grow. And this would make sense because, you know, an area that is highly inundated with flooding as a disturbance would make it so that, you know, only species with a high ability to grow in that area would be able to grow there, and then at low frequencies of this disturbance, you would expect to see highly competitive species taking advantage. But, excuse me, unfortunately, well, fortunately actually, we saw absolutely no correlation whatsoever between where plots are situated and distance from this dry season channel. We did find moderately strong correlations with north-south directionality, and this was really interesting because it wasn't one of the variables that we initially thought would be of extreme importance. And through sort of further investigations, we've been able to suggest that possibly a lot of this may be from dispersal mechanisms and the actual ability of a plant to establish after a flooding event. So you have very different habitats outside of this spatial zone that we tested. So we were testing in this area. Excuse me. And to the south here, you have a permanent marsh swamp, which has a very different species composition than this dryland savanna that's sort of to the left and to the right of this swamp area, of this floodplain area. And then to the north, along this corridor here, you have a riverine system, which has a lot of fig trees and sort of permanent riverine vegetation that, again, is very different from what you find in other areas. So part of the reason we may be seeing this north-south variation is the fact that different plants are able to actually disperse to certain areas than areas further south, which may be dispersing from the marsh area. So, and the last thing that we tested was this grazing intensity, which sort of ties into the third question we asked. And interestingly, the highest correlated variable we looked at was this intensity of grazing, which, at first suggests that there is a very high specificity of foraging. So what we were able to do is we were able to look into the dung counts that we measured, and over 95% of the dung measured was livestock from the Maasai, so either cattle, sheep, or goats. Only about 5% were wildlife counts. So you're obviously seeing a much higher inundation by the pastoralists at this time than you were from the wildlife. Interestingly, cattle were very equally distributed across the entire floodplain, but sheep and goats were not. So these groups here correlate to the graphs that I showed you before. So you have that one group that was further to the south and the one group that was further to the north. And you can see a significantly higher amount of dung counts found in those southern groups than in the northern groups. So, there's a lot of sort of suggestions that we can make from this, that, you're having one type of forager come in and specify on one, type of plant composition. So you're getting a really high intensity of grazing on one specific area. It's hard to say whether this is limiting the ability for these species to grow, but it definitely is a cause of concern in terms of where this pressure is being isolated to. So, after all of those graphs and statistics, why is any of this important at all? I think the biggest take-home message from this is that in a lot of systems we can't just assume that abiotic factors like flooding are the primary driver in the system, which is what a lot of riverine ecology has really concentrated on in literature. And there are very few papers that have suggested that grazing impact can have an influence in between those flooding events. And I think that this research shows that grazing is actually having more of an impact between those flooding events than flooding is having on how the habitat is being structured. And in terms of vegetation dynamics, that's crucial. And it's obvious that the grazing is having some sort of impact on the system. And in terms of further research, it really opens up a lot of questions into actually asking how much of an influence that grazing pressure is having, and how much then that correlates with this other disturbance of the flooding event. So after every flooding event, do things actually reset, and we then see the same grazing in the same areas, but it's not long-term affecting the composition of the species or the biodiversity in the area? And these are questions we can't fully answer from this data set, but it sets up the areas where we need to be asking these questions. So it really highlights that one group that is being very specifically grazed by a very specific type of forager. And it's a cause of concern for management and for further conservation issues. And one of the greatest things that did come out of this work is the organizations that I've worked with have now added floodplain plots to their long-term monitoring. So they're able to, track sort of temporal changes of what's going on. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the best thing that can come out of work like this, is to actually, see the influence and see further research being done on highlighted areas of concern, because these areas are, both from an environmental standpoint and from an economic standpoint for the Maasai, just such crucial areas for their survival. And for sustainable use as well. The Maasai are seeing huge population increases. Everybody wants more cows, wants more goats, wants more sheep. People now know about the systems like this floodplain in other areas. We had people during the 2009 drought come all the way up from Tanzania to use this grazing area. So, can the system handle more intense grazing? Can the system handle more cows, but not more sheep or more goats? What type of impact are all these things having? And that all ties into the future use of this area. So, just a couple of acknowledgements. I just want to identify 4 amazing field assistants I had: Nixon, Jackson, David, and Patrick. Their names never get said aloud enough, and they are phenomenal individuals. They're out there 45, 50-degree weather with me every day, and really just phenomenal individuals. And everyone at ACC, Soralo, Leleinoc, all the organizations I worked with, you know, for welcoming in a little Canadian Mzungu to their, you know, to their arms. And Wayne, of course, for your unwavering support. This has been a 1.5 years in the making, between, you know, me coming to you and being like, I'm going to go to Kenya, what do you think? And Gary Bradfield's not here today, but he was instrumental in the learning curve of all this ordination work. I would never have gotten through it without him. And of course, all you guys here today and the friends and family who aren't here today, you've seen me through this pretty crazy adventure, and I thank you all for it. So, just a couple of references, and thanks. And questions, please. Try to be shy.
So what have you thought any, you were talking about like areas that were being specifically grazed to see by cattle and stuff like that. Do you see any specific patterns in wildlife grazing particularly?
No, it was really interesting that we tried really hard to see wildlife, but there sort of was 2 factors in that I think are reasons why we're not seeing it. One, this wasn't a particularly high intensity dry season. Like, I mean, yes, it was a dry season, but it wasn't a drought year. And I think there is still suitable grazing within the conservancy areas for wildlife to be able to stay away from Maasai settlements. They didn't have to come and be close to cattle and stuff in order to graze. During the drought, we have tons of photos of this swamp area with, you know, zebra, impala, and a goat all grazing within, you know, 3 meters of each other. So it does happen, but I think the wildlife generally choose not to do that unless they really, really have to.